What would you do if you paid for a first-class seat, only to be told you didn't belong there? What if the insult wasn't about money, or tickets, or rules, but about who you are? On Flight 227. A 13-year-old boy named Malik Langston sat quietly beside his father, unaware that the night would test not just his courage, but his dignity. A wealthy passenger, Catherine Whitmore, demanded his removal, insisting that first class was not meant for people like him. The crew hesitated. Silence hung heavy, and a child's confidence began to crumble under the weight of prejudice. But what no one realized was the calm, steady man in seat 2A was not just Malik's father. Christopher Langston was the majority shareholder of the very airline they were flying, and when he finally stood, his words would not only defend his son, they would change the future of the company forever. Would dignity prevail 30,000 feet above the ground, or would silence win again? Stay with us as we unfold this powerful story of courage, truth, and justice in the skies. And before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to join us for more stories that matter. The terminal at Los Angeles International buzzed with its usual chaos. Families tugged at rolling suitcases. Business travelers barked into phones, and the sharp voice of the overhead announcements cut through the swirl of languages and footsteps. Amid the noise and shuffle, Christopher Langston walked at a steady, unhurried pace, his hand resting lightly on the shoulder of his son. Malik was 13, tall for his age, with the restless energy of someone caught between childhood and manhood. His eyes darted from gate signs to passing faces, absorbing every detail with curiosity. He clutched his backpack tightly, as though inside it lay not just snacks and headphones, but a piece of his identity he needed to hold close. "You nervous?" Christopher asked quietly as they reached gate 42. Malik hesitated, then nodded. "A little. I've never sat in first class before. What if people stare?" Christopher chuckled softly, a deep sound that always reassured his son. "People stare when they see something they don't expect. That's not your burden to carry. Remember, Malik, you belong anywhere. Your ticket says you belong." They paused at the gate counter, where a harried agent scanned their passes without much eye contact. Malik noticed the agent's brief frown, that quick narrowing of the eyes before forcing a polite smile. It was a look Malik had seen before in different places, a silent question about whether he fit. His stomach tightened, but Christopher's calm presence steadied him. As they stepped into the jet bridge, Malik exhaled. The air smelled faintly of fuel and recycled air, tinged with the metallic hum of the aircraft systems waiting to come alive. Inside the cabin, the contrast was striking. Plush leather seats, wide aisles, the hushed efficiency of flight attendants preparing champagne flutes for passengers who had already settled in. Malik's eyes widened as they reached seats 2A and 2B, their seats. He slid into 2A by the window, his fingers grazing the smooth leather. "This is... wow," he whispered. Christopher smiled, taking his seat beside him. "Comfort doesn't define worth, son, but it's nice to experience." Malik leaned against the window, watching baggage handlers below load containers. He loved the rhythm of airports, the way people and machines moved in choreographed urgency. It reminded him of his own dream one day, designing systems that kept planes flying safely across continents. As he watched, a woman entered the cabin, a striking presence in a tailored cream suit, her blonde hair cut in an immaculate bob. She carried herself with the confidence of someone used to command, her eyes scanning the cabin with an unspoken claim of ownership. Her name, though Malik did not know it yet, was Catherine Whitmore. At that moment, she was simply a stranger whose sharp glance swept across the rows and lingered on him. Malik felt her eyes, heavy and assessing, as though she were calculating whether he belonged. He shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Christopher noticed. He always noticed. He placed a hand on his son's arm, a silent signal. Steady yourself. A flight attendant brushed past with a tray of drinks. The sound of ice cubes clinking in crystal glasses filled the pause. Malik tried to focus on the world outside his window again, but unease had settled in his chest. "Dad," he whispered. "Yes. Do you think people are surprised we're sitting here?" Christopher looked at his son, his face calm, his tone deliberate. "They might be, but surprise doesn't change truth. You earned your place in this world by being you, and I earned this ticket the same way anyone else did by paying for it. That's the only measure that matters here." Malik nodded slowly, though the knot in his stomach remained. The boarding continued. Businessmen in dark suits stored briefcases in overhead bins. A young couple in matching sweatshirts giggled as they snapped selfies. The cabin filled with the low murmur of conversations, the occasional clatter of luggage wheels, and the rustle of magazines being pulled from seatback pockets. Then Catherine Whitmore approached their row. Her heels clicked against the carpet, each step deliberate, each movement radiating a sense of expectation. She paused beside seat 2A, her gaze narrowing on Malik. For a long moment, she said nothing. The silence was louder than words. Malik looked up at her, unsure whether to smile or shrink into his seat. Christopher's eyes lifted, meeting hers with quiet steadiness. Something passed between them, an unspoken challenge, invisible but undeniable. Catherine's lips tightened, and she moved past without a word, taking her place a few rows behind. But Malik felt it, the weight of her disapproval, the certainty that this was not the end. He turned back to his father. "She looked at me like I stole something." Christopher rested his hand on Malik's arm again. His voice was low, firm, almost like a prayer whispered into the noise of the cabin. "Son, when someone questions your right to exist where you are, don't let it plant doubt inside you. You're here because you belong here. Never forget that." The engines roared to life, vibrations trembling through the floor. Flight attendants secured carts, checked belts, and offered practice smiles. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers with pre-flight announcements. Yet beneath the ritual of departure, Malik sensed the tension was not over. Oh, something about the woman's stare lingered in his mind, pressing against the fragile excitement he had felt earlier. Christopher leaned back in his seat, eyes closed, as though conserving his strength for a battle yet to come. Malik watched him, wondering how his father could remain so calm when his own heart pounded with unease. The glass of water on Christopher's tray rattled slightly as the plane pushed back from the gate. Outside, the runway lights blurred into streaks. The journey had only just begun. But Malik felt as though a storm was already gathering in the pressurized cabin. He looked once more at his father and whispered to himself, barely audible, even over the hum of the engines, "Stay calm, Malik. Stay calm, like him." And so, as the aircraft rolled toward the runway, father and son sat side by side, united in silence, unaware that within the next hour, their dignity would be tested before a captive audience of strangers 30,000 feet above the ground. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as boarding neared completion. Malik shifted in his seat, fiddling with the zipper of his backpack. He kept sneaking glances over his shoulder, where the woman in the cream suit had settled several rows back. Even from that distance, he could feel her eyes brush against him every now and then, like a cold draft. It unsettled him, like a question left unanswered. Christopher noticed, of course. He had a way of noticing without looking, a way of reading the smallest tremor in his son's breathing. He leaned slightly closer. "Window's a good seat," he said softly, as though changing the subject. "You get to watch the whole choreography out there." Malik forced himself to look outside. The sun was lowering behind the terminal, streaks of gold and crimson cutting through the smog. Ground crew in neon vests directed trucks, checked cargo hatches, and moved like ants with precise rhythm. For a moment, the beauty of it held his attention. Still, the knot in his stomach remained. He had never sat in first class before. He remembered long flights in economy narrow seats, the steady press of strangers' shoulders against his, the chorus of crying babies. This felt like another world, entirely the wide leather, the polished wood trim, the attendants offering hot towels as though comfort were a birthright. Malik wondered if other passengers were wondering the same thing he feared, that he did not belong here. Christopher unfolded the menu tucked into the armrest and handed it to Malik. "What do you think, short rib or salmon Malik?" skimmed the elegant lettering, feeling clumsy just holding it. "Salmon. Maybe. It feels, I don't know. Fancier? Fancy doesn't always mean better," Christopher said with a small smile. "But it's good to try something new." Malik traced the embossed logo at the bottom of the menu. He thought about how his classmates would react if he told them about this. Some would envy him. Others would make jokes. A few might quietly wonder the same thing Catherine Whitmore seemed to wonder, how a black boy his age could possibly end up in 2A on a flight like this. The thought made his chest tighten. As the last passengers filed in, the flight attendants moved briskly, their smiles taut from repetition. Samantha Cruz, the lead flight attendant, moved down the aisle checking overhead bins. She paused briefly at row 2, her gaze sweeping over Malik and Christopher. For just a fraction of a second, Malik caught something in her eyes, surprise, perhaps, or doubt. Then her professional mask slid back into place, and she gave a practiced nod before continuing. Malik's shoulders hunched slightly. Christopher placed a hand on the boy's knee. Steady, but firm. "Remember what I told you," he murmured. "Your worth is not measured by anyone's glance." Malik nodded, though inside he still wrestled with unease. Behind them, Catherine Whitmore spoke in a low, clipped tone to another passenger. Malik caught only fragments words like mistake and ridiculous. He clenched his jaw, pressing his forehead briefly to the cool window. Christopher closed his eyes for a moment. He could feel the tension building, like static before a storm. He knew this was not over. He had lived too long, walked into too many rooms where his presence was met with disbelief, not to recognize the pattern. The question was not whether confrontation would come, but when. A soft chime announced final boarding. The cabin door closed, followed by the heavy thunk of the latch ceiling. The engines whirred louder, a rising hum beneath the floor. Malik swallowed hard. He tried to distract himself by studying the safety card, but his thoughts wandered back to the woman's stare. He wanted to ask his father why she looked at him that way, why people sometimes seem to think they own places simply by entering them, but he bit his tongue. His father had told him often enough. Sometimes silence is the loudest answer. The aircraft began to push back from the gate. The cabin crew performed their demonstrations with mechanical cheer. Malik barely heard the words. He stared down at his sneakers, trying to ground himself in something familiar. Christopher watched his son, feeling the conflict playing out silently in the boy's posture. He remembered his own first flight in first class, decades earlier, when a man had tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Son, This isn't your seat." He remembered the sting, the shame, the fight it took to remain calm. That memory burned quietly now, fueling his resolve. This time, he told himself, it will end differently. The plane taxied to the runway. Malik pressed his forehead back to the window, watching the lights blur as they picked up speed. The sudden thrust pinned him against his seat. For a moment, the power of flight washed away everything else. His heart leapt with excitement as the ground fell away, the city shrinking beneath him. But as the plane climbed into the dusky sky, Malik knew the unease inside him had not vanished. It had only been carried higher, into thinner air where every sound, every word, every gesture seemed amplified. The attendants moved again, securing carts and checking belts. Samantha Cruz passed through the aisle once more. She gave a perfunctory smile at Christopher, then at Malik. This time Malik thought he caught something else in her glance: hesitation, maybe even pity. He hated that look most of all. When Samantha moved on, Malik whispered, "Dad, why do they keep looking at me like that?" Christopher opened his eyes and regarded his son steadily, because people carry stories in their heads about what they expect to see. When reality doesn't match their story, they don't know how to handle it. That's not your fault, Malik. That's their weakness. Malik let the words sink in. He wanted to believe them, but the knot inside him stayed tight. Christopher's own mind was less still than his calm exterior suggested. He measured every glance, every shift in tone, from the crew. He weighed whether to confront it early or let it unfold, knowing that his son was watching him, learning from every choice. He prayed silently for the wisdom to handle what was coming with strength, but without anger. The dinner service began. Plates clinked softly, silverware gleamed, and the scent of warm bread filled the air. Malik tried to relax, tried to enjoy the salmon he had chosen, but the taste was dull against the unease at the back of his throat. Christopher ate slowly, eyes calm, as though every bite were a statement. We belong here. We take our time. We will not be rushed out of our place. Several rows back, Catherine Whitmore set down her wineglass with a decisive clink. She leaned forward, her voice carrying just enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Unbelievable," she muttered. "Absolutely unbelievable." Malik froze. His fork trembled in his hand. He looked to his father, who continued chewing, unhurried. Christopher's gaze lifted briefly, meeting Catherine's across the cabin. No words were exchanged, yet the air between them thickened with the promise of confrontation. The engines droned steadily as the aircraft cut eastward through the darkening sky. Somewhere above the clouds, stars began to pierce the twilight. Inside the cabin, however, another constellation was forming small sparks of judgment, unease, and defiance, ready to ignite. Malik leaned close to his father, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, I don't think she's done with us." Christopher's expression did not change. His eyes remained calm, his voice steady. "I know, son, and when the moment comes, we'll meet it together." He reached across the small space and clasped Malik's hand firmly. For the boy, the touch was an anchor in the turbulence of doubt. For the father, it was a vow whatever storm was coming, they would endure it side by side. The seatbelt sign chimed softly. A flight attendant dimmed the lights, inviting passengers to relax. Some leaned back with headphones, others unfolded blankets. Yet even in the half-dark, Malik could feel Catherine's presence like a shadow stretched across the aisle. He closed his eyes, trying to will himself into sleep. But beneath his lids, The images played out already: the stares, the muttered words, the sense of being on trial in a court where he had committed no crime but existence. Christopher sensed his son's restlessness and squeezed his hand once more. "Rest if you can," he said quietly. Strength is built in silence. 2. The plane cut steadily through the night sky, but inside row 2, tension gathered like storm clouds, waiting for the lightning strike that would turn unease into open conflict. The cabin had settled into that early phase of flight when passengers begin to relax, when the rush of boarding fades into a steady hum and people slip into their own bubbles of comfort. The lights were dim, the seatbelts sign off, and attendants moved quietly with practiced efficiency. Malik had begun to feel his body loosen against the leather, lulled by the drone of the engines. For a few brief minutes, he believed maybe the tension would dissolve. Maybe nothing would happen after all. But then Catherine Whitmore stood. It was not a casual rise, not the slow stretch of someone heading for the restroom. It was deliberate, her movements sharp, her chin high. She walked the short distance down the aisle and stopped directly beside Seat 2A, where Malik sat. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm but edged with disdain. "You're in my seat." Malik's head snapped toward her, his stomach clenching. He glanced at the glowing numbers above 2A. His ticket tucked in the seat pocket said the same. Still, the certainty in her tone made him falter. For a moment, the boy wondered if somehow he had made a mistake. Christopher turned his head slowly, his expression composed. "No, ma'am," he said in a measured voice. "This is our seat. Both of our tickets are for row 2. Catherine's eyes narrowed. She let out a short laugh, more scoff than amusement. "I think you're mistaken. I've flown this route dozens of times. Seat 2A is mine." She tapped her own boarding pass with a manicured nail, as though that alone proved her case. But she held it too quickly, flashing it without letting anyone else truly read it. Her focus remained locked on Malik, who shrank slightly under the weight of her gaze. Passengers nearby stirred, heads turned. Whispers began to flutter across the cabin. The fragile cocoon of first-class serenity cracked. Malik's throat tightened. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, but the words tangled like threads. He felt exposed, as though every eye in the cabin were waiting to see if he would break. Christopher rested his hand on Malik's shoulder. His calm presence was a shield. "Our boarding passes were scanned at the gate," he said evenly. "We are in the correct seats." Catherine's smile thinned. "Well, mistakes happen. Clearly the system has put you here by accident. But I assure you, this is not where you're supposed to be. Why don't you move before this becomes embarrassing?" The word stung. Embarrassing. Malik flinched as though struck. His chest burned with humiliation, even though he knew he had done nothing wrong. Christopher's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Inside, a flicker of anger stirred, but he pressed it down. He had learned long ago that anger only fed people like Catherine, confirming their prejudices. Calm was his weapon, dignity his armor. "We'll remain in our assigned seats," he said, his tone firm but not raised. "There's no mistake." Catherine's eyes darted around, seeking allies. A man in the row behind shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. A woman across the aisle frowned, but said nothing. The silence of bystanders was heavy, complicit. Finally, Catherine raised her hand, signaling down the aisle. "Excuse me, flight attendant. We have a problem here." Samantha Cruz approached, her professional smile fixed, though there was a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. She had sensed tension earlier. Now it was breaking into open conflict. "Yes," Ma'am Samantha asked politely. "This boy is sitting in my seat," Catherine declared. Her voice carried, ensuring more passengers turned to listen. "I've asked them to move, but they refuse. Can you handle this?" Please. Malik shrank lower into his seat. The word boy cut deeper than Catherine probably intended, or perhaps exactly as she intended. At 13, he was still a child. But in this moment the word felt weaponized, used to strip him of legitimacy, of belonging. Samantha glanced at Malik, then at Christopher. "May I see your boarding passes, sir?" she asked cautiously. Christopher handed them over without hesitation. His movements were deliberate, measured, as though each gesture were part of a performance meant to teach his son something important. Samantha checked the passes, her brow furrowing slightly. "These are for 2A and 2B. "That's correct. There must be a mistake," Catherine interrupted. "Check mine." She thrust her boarding pass forward, her hand trembling slightly with impatience. Samantha took it, scanning quickly. She hesitated, then looked back at Catherine. "Your seat is actually 4A, ma'am. Just a few rows back." For a beat. Silence filled the cabin. Malik exhaled quietly, relief washing over him. But Catherine's cheeks flushed pink, her lips pressing into a thin line. "That can't be right," she said sharply. "I always booked 2A. There must have been an error." Samantha offered a diplomatic smile. "Sometimes specific seats are unavailable, but your pass clearly shows 4A. Catherine's eyes flicked to Malik again, burning with indignation. "I don't care what the pass says. Everyone knows 2A isn't meant for—" "Well," she trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the air. The weight of her unspoken prejudice pressed against Malik like a physical force. Christopher's hand tightened gently on his son's shoulder. He did not rise, did not raise his voice. His stillness carried its own gravity. "My son is in his rightful seat," he said quietly, but the firmness in his tone cut through the murmurs around them. Passengers shifted. Some looked away, unwilling to be part of the confrontation. Others watched intently, phones poised subtly as if recording. The air was thick with expectation. Samantha hesitated. She wanted the conflict to end, wanted peace restored. Yet the power dynamic in front of her was complicated. Catherine exuded the entitlement of someone accustomed to winning. Christopher radiated the calm certainty of someone who refused to yield. Malik sat frozen between them, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to disappear, to sink into the seat until he no longer existed. Another part, smaller but growing, wanted to stand, to shout that he belonged, to demand that the woman stop. The battle raged silently inside him, his hands clenched into fists in his lap. Catherine straightened her spine, her voice rising. "If you don't resolve this, I will speak to the captain myself." "This is unacceptable." Samantha nodded quickly, caught in the pressure of appeasement. "Let me confer with the purser," she said. Retreating down the aisle, Catherine lingered another moment, her eyes sweeping the boy and his father with disdain, before stalking back to her seat in row 4. But the damage was done. The cabin buzzed with whispers, tension thick as smoke. Malik stared down at his lap, his eyes burning. Shame coiled inside him, though he knew he had no reason for it. He hated that she had made him feel small, hated that silence had been his only weapon. Christopher leaned closer, his voice a low murmur only his son could hear. "Listen to me, Malik. Dignity isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about knowing who you are, even when others try to tell you otherwise. Remember that." Malik nodded, though his throat was tight. He wanted to believe his father's words, but the humiliation clung to him. Christopher sat back, his expression unreadable. Inside, though, his mind churned. He had expected prejudice to surface at some point. He had lived through it too many times to be surprised. But seeing it directed at his son, that cut deeper than anything he had endured himself. The question gnawed at him when the next challenge came. How far should he go? Should he reveal his power, expose his identity, or let the lesson unfold in its raw, painful form? The engines roared a little louder as the plane climbed higher into the night sky. The cabin lights dimmed further, but the tension glowed like embers, waiting for a breath to ignite into flame. Malik closed his eyes, trying to escape into darkness, but all he could see was Catherine's face, her eyes filled with disbelief and contempt. And deep inside, a voice whispered a question he could not silence. Why do they think we don't belong? Christopher turned his gaze to the window, watching the stars emerge above the clouds. He breathed deeply, holding his calm like a shield. He knew this was only the beginning. The hum of the engines filled the silence after Catherine retreated to her seat in row 4. Conversations resumed in fragments, but the air never truly settled. It was as if every passenger in the cabin carried an invisible thread of tension, and each glance, each whisper pulled it tighter. Malik tried to breathe steadily, tried to pretend nothing had happened, but he could still feel the woman's words clinging to him like smoke. Samantha Cruz reappeared minutes later, walking briskly down the aisle with another attendant at her side. Her face was set in the neutral expression airline staff were trained to wear, but her eyes betrayed unease. She stopped at row 2, crouched slightly to meet Christopher's calm gaze, and lowered her voice. "Sir, I'm terribly sorry for the confusion," she began, though her words carried more obligation than sincerity. "Mrs. Whitmore believes there's been a mistake. To keep things running smoothly, would you and your son consider relocating to another row? We have open seats toward the back of the cabin." Malik's breath caught. He looked at his father, fear and shame flashing across his face. Christopher did not flinch. His voice was measured, his tone almost gentle, but it carried the weight of immovable stone. "No. These are our seats. Our boarding passes confirm it. My son will remain where he belongs." Samantha straightened, shifting uncomfortably under his steady gaze. She wasn't used to passengers refusing when she tried to smooth over conflict. Behind her, the second attendant glanced nervously down the aisle toward Catherine, who was watching with keen interest, her lips pursed in satisfaction. "I understand," Samantha said carefully, "but Mrs. Whitmore is a loyal passenger, and she's insisting on resolution. We just want to avoid disruption." Christopher's eyes softened, though his voice remained firm. Avoiding disruption is not the same as avoiding injustice. If you ask me to move my son from his rightful seat to appease someone else's prejudice, you are choosing convenience over fairness. The words landed heavier than Samantha expected. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, unable to conjure a ready reply. Malik sat frozen, his hands gripping the armrests. His chest swelled with pride at his father's resolve, but fear gnawed at him too. He had seen videos online of people dragged from planes, of confrontations spiraling into chaos. He wondered if that was about to be them. Passengers nearby leaned in, ears pricked, phones were angled discreetly, red recording lights blinking faintly in the dim cabin. The confrontation was no longer private, it had become a spectacle. Samantha cleared her throat. Perhaps we should have the captain review the situation, she suggested. Christopher inclined his head slightly. Yes, let's do that. She nodded stiffly and walked away, her heels clicking against the carpet. Malik watched her retreat, his pulse racing. He whispered to his father, "What if the captain sides with her Christopher placed a steady hand on his son's arm? Then we'll face that too. But remember, Malik truth doesn't change just because people try to ignore it. You know what's right. Hold on to that." The boy swallowed hard, trying to draw strength from his father's calm. Still, doubt swirled inside him. What if calm wasn't enough? What if justice never came? A few minutes later, the cabin door at the front opened and Captain Daniel Everett stepped through. His crisp uniform and square shoulders carried the authority of command. The murmurs quieted instantly. The captain's presence was gravity. He approached row 2, his expression professional, his eyes scanning Christopher and Malik before flicking toward Catherine. "Good evening," he said in a firm voice. "I understand we have a seating dispute." Catherine was on her feet in an instant. "Captain Everett, thank you. I've flown with this airline for years. Seat 2A has always been mine. Clearly there's been an error. These two are occupying my place." Her words spilled out with practiced indignation, each syllable sharpened to cut. The captain nodded politely, then turned to Christopher. "Sir, may I see your boarding passes?" Christopher handed them over without hesitation. Malik watched as the captain examined them carefully. The silence stretched long enough for every passenger to lean forward in anticipation. "Your passes are valid," Captain Everett said at last, his tone even. "You are assigned to 2A and 2B. Relief surged in Malik's chest, but it was fleeting. Catherine immediately interjected, her voice rising. "Captain, surely you see the issue here. This isn't about passes. It's about maintaining standards in first class. This boy doesn't belong here." Gas rippled through the cabin. Even in the carefully curated world of luxury travel, Catherine's bluntness shocked. Malik felt his face burn, humiliation flooding through him like fire. He wanted to disappear, to vanish into the leather seat and escape every pair of eyes now fixed on him. Christopher's jaw clenched. His voice, however, remained composed. "My son belongs wherever his ticket places him. Nothing more, nothing less." The captain's eyes flickered, betraying discomfort. He glanced toward Samantha, then back to Catherine, then to Christopher. He was a man caught between schedule and principle, between the easy path and the just one. "Sir," Captain Everett said carefully, "for the sake of keeping this flight on time, might you consider another seat? Just this once." The words sliced deeper than Catherine's insult. Malik's stomach dropped. Even the captain authority itself was asking them to yield. Christopher took a slow breath. Inside, his mind roiled. Memories of his own youth resurfaced the day he was told to stand at the back of a classroom, the time a bus driver forced him to vacate a seat despite paying his fare, each wound scarred over but never fully healed. And now, history threatened to repeat itself in front of his son. "No," he said firmly. His eyes locked on the captain's. "We will not move. My son will not learn that dignity is negotiable. Not tonight. Not ever." The cabin held its breath. Catherine's face twisted in outrage. Malik stared at his father, awe mixing with fear. He felt the ground shifting, the fragile balance of power teetering on the edge of collapse. Captain Everett hesitated, clearly torn. His hand rose to his radio, as though tempted to call security. Samantha shifted nervously beside him, her face pale. Passengers began whispering louder. Phones raced higher. The confrontation had become theater, and the world outside the cabin would soon be its audience. Catherine's voice cut through the murmurs. "If this isn't resolved immediately, I'll take it up with corporate. This airline cannot afford to mistreat its most loyal customers." Her words dripped with entitlement, with the certainty that she was untouchable. Malak's fist tightened in his lap, nails digging into his palms. He wanted to scream, to tell her she was wrong, but the words caught in his throat. Christopher's hand found his son's again, grounding him. His calm voice rose just enough for the cabin to hear. "The problem isn't the seat. The problem is respect." A hush fell. Even Catherine faltered, her mouth opening, then snapping shut. The captain shifted uncomfortably, clearly shaken by the weight of the moment. He looked at Christopher, then Malek, then Catherine. His lips parted, but before he could speak, the plane jolted slightly in turbulence. The overhead lights flickered, and a glass clinked on a tray. The moment stretched thin, trembling on the edge of eruption. Malek's heart hammered in his chest. He knew this wasn't over. The storm was still building, and when it broke, it would shake more than just the cabin of Flight 227. The cabin still hummed with whispers after the turbulence subsided. Passengers leaned back in their seats, some pretending to read, others scrolling through their phones, but almost everyone kept their attention fixed on row 2. Malek could feel it, the invisible weight of all those eyes pressing against him. His salmon sat untouched, the scent of lemon butter sauce mingling with his nausea. Captain Daniel Everett lingered in the aisle a moment longer, his hands clasped behind his back. His posture was stiff, the kind of stiffness that betrayed inner conflict. He cleared his throat softly and spoke in the tone of someone used to being obeyed. "Mr. Langston, I understand your position, but this flight is scheduled tightly. We can't afford extended delays. If you would be willing to relocate to another row, just this once, it would resolve the matter quickly." Malek's heart sank. It wasn't just Catherine anymore. Now even the captain, the highest authority on the aircraft, was asking them to move. The boy's chest tightened, a mix of fear and shame rising like a tide. He looked at his father, searching for answers in his calm expression. Christopher Langston leaned back in his seat. His voice was steady, but his mind was anything but calm. He heard echoes of his past, of voices telling him to wait his turn, to move aside, to let things go for the sake of peace. He remembered standing on a bus as a teenager while a white passenger sat in the seat he had paid for. He remembered the silent humiliation of stepping aside, of knowing no one would speak up for him. He remembered promising himself that if he ever had children, he would not let them grow up thinking silence was survival. "No," Christopher said at last, his voice firm but quiet enough to force the captain to lean in to hear. "We will not move. My son belongs here. I will not teach him that dignity is optional." The words carried more force than volume. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Someone in the back clapped softly before quickly stopping when no one else joined. Malek felt a surge of pride, but fear still gnawed at him. Catherine Whitmore rose again from row 4, her face flushed with irritation. "Captain Everett, this is absurd. You're letting them dictate terms. I've flown first class with this airline for 20 years. 20 years. Are you really going to side with them over me?" Her voice cracked like a whip, slicing through the dimmed cabin. Passengers recoiled slightly, but no one spoke up. The silence of complicity was louder than any defense. The captain looked trapped. His duty was to safety, to order, to time. He hated disputes that grew into scenes. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "please return to your seat for now. We'll resolve this." Catherine glared at him, then at Christopher and Malik. She let out a sharp breath through her nose before sinking back into 4A, muttering loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. Unbelievable. Completely unacceptable. Malik's hands trembled in his lap. He squeezed them into fists, pressing his nails into his palms. His mind spun with conflicting thoughts. He wanted to disappear, to escape the stairs, to make this whole ordeal vanish. But another part of him, smaller, fiercer, wanted to stand, to shout that his seat was his, that he was not a mistake. The struggle churned inside him like turbulence he could not control. Christopher noticed. He placed a steady hand on Malik's arm, grounding him. "Breathe. Son," he whispered. "Don't let her poison. Become yours." Malik swallowed hard. But what if they drag us off? What? If everyone believes her? They don't need to believe her, Christopher said, his eyes fixed straight ahead. They need to believe themselves. People reveal who they are when pressure builds. Watch closely. You'll see. The words puzzled Malik, but he clung to them like a lifeline. Samantha Cruz returned, her smile forced, her eyes betraying unease. She addressed Christopher softly. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but we must also consider the comfort of all our passengers. If this escalates, it could create a disturbance." Christopher met her gaze evenly. "The disturbance isn't coming from us. It's coming from the refusal to accept that my son belongs here. Don't confuse the source with the symptom." Samantha faltered. Her training had not prepared her for passengers who spoke with such quiet authority. She nodded stiffly and retreated again, her hands clasped tightly around her tablet. The plane continued eastward, the night sky pressing against the windows. Stars glittered faintly above the dark clouds. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing minute. Malik leaned closer to his father. "I don't understand why she hates us so much. She doesn't even know us." Christopher closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, gazing out at the sky. "Sometimes people carry hate not because of who you are, but because of what they refuse to see in themselves. They look at you and see something that threatens their story, and so they try to erase you from it." The boy listened intently, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. The words sank into him, heavy but clarifying. "Does it ever stop?" Malik asked quietly. Christopher's lips pressed into a thin line. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to tell his son that the world had changed, that dignity would always triumph. But truth demanded honesty, even when it hurt. "Not always," he admitted. "But you can choose how to respond. You can let their hate define you, or you can show them that your dignity cannot be moved." Malik nodded slowly, the lesson etching itself into his young heart. Captain Everett reappeared once more, his face tight. He bent down slightly toward Christopher. "Sir, I need to warn you. If this dispute continues, I may have to involve ground authorities upon landing. I'd prefer to avoid that outcome." Christopher did not flinch. "Do what you must, Captain, but understand this: if you allow her prejudice to dictate your actions, the disturbance won't end when we land. It will grow, it will spread, and the world will know." The captain held his gaze, and for the first time, he faltered. He saw something in Christopher's eyes he had not expected, an unshakable calm, a certainty that came not from arrogance, but from truth. He straightened, unsettled, and left without another word. Malik exhaled shakily. "Dad, do you think he'll really call the police? Maybe, Christopher said. His tone was even, but his hand tightened slightly on the armrest. But if he does, they won't be the only ones waiting when we land. Mullick frowned, not fully understanding, but his father's steady confidence gave him comfort, even in uncertainty. Minutes passed, heavy with silence. Catherine shifted noisily in her seat, making a show of her displeasure. Passengers avoided her eyes, their own discomfort keeping them quiet, but phones continued to record, capturing every word, every glance, every refusal to yield. Mullick closed his eyes, trying to steady himself. His father's words replayed in his mind, "Dignity isn't optional." The thought both frightened and strengthened him. Christopher sat upright, his face serene, though inside his heart pounded. He knew the stakes were climbing. He knew this confrontation would not remain confined to a cabin in the sky. The storm was gathering, and when it broke, it would expose more than just one woman's prejudice. It would test the very core of what his son believed about the world. The engines roared steadily, carrying them eastward through the night, but in row 2, time itself felt suspended. Every breath a countdown to the next escalation. The cabin had grown quiet again, but it was the kind of quiet that wasn't peace. It was brittle, like glass ready to shatter. The hum of the engine seemed louder in the silence, filling the gaps between unspoken words. Mullick sat stiffly in his seat, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He kept his eyes on the window, though the endless black outside offered no comfort. His reflection in the glass stared back at him, wide-eyed, small, and uncertain. Christopher sat beside him, appearing calm, though his mind was anything but still. He could sense the judgment still hovering in the air, the way Catherine Whitmore shifted noisily in row 4, the way passengers peeked at them from behind magazines and cell phones. He had lived in silence like this before, the silence of boardrooms when his presence unsettled expectations, the silence of strangers who doubted his place. But this time it wasn't only about him. His son was watching. His son was learning. Mullick broke the silence first. "Dad, why didn't anyone say anything?" Christopher turned slightly, his face softening. "What do you mean?" "When she said those things," Mullick whispered, "everyone heard her. Nobody stood up. Nobody told her to stop." He paused, his voice cracking. "It's like they all agreed." The words pierced Christopher's heart. He wanted to shield Mullick from that reality, but he could not lie. Sometimes silence is fear, sometimes it's complicity, and sometimes, son. People stay quiet because speaking truth feels harder than ignoring injustice. Mullick's brows furrowed. "But isn't that wrong? It is," Christopher said gently. "But it's also human. Remember this moment. Remember how their silence feels. And when you are older, when you see someone else being treated unfairly, you will know what it means to speak." Mullick nodded, though the hurt lingered in his eyes. A flight attendant passed with a tray of drinks. Mullick noticed how she avoided looking directly at him. Her smile forced as she set a glass of water on his father's table. Even small gestures carried meaning. The boy swallowed hard, his throat dry. Catherine's voice floated forward again, low but sharp enough to cut through the cabin. "This entire flight has been compromised by incompetence. Standards are falling. I'll be contacting the airline the moment we land." Christopher's jaw tightened, though he didn't move. Mullick's chest tightened too, but for a different reason. He wanted to shout back at her, to tell her she was wrong, to defend his father and himself. The words rose in his throat, hot and heavy, but he couldn't release them. Fear strangled his voice. What if shouting made things worse? What if people thought he was the problem? He stared at his father instead, willing him to do something, to say something. Christopher remained composed, silent but steady. His restraint both inspired and confused Malik. Was calmness strength, or was it surrender? The boy's thoughts spiraled. He thought of his classmates, of the way some teachers looked surprised when he got the highest test score, of the security guard who once followed him through a store. He thought of the unease in the gate agent's eyes earlier, of the flight attendant's hesitation. Piece by piece, the pattern formed. It wasn't just about a seat. It was about something bigger, something heavier than he had ever fully understood. He leaned closer to his father. Does it ever stop? Christopher's eyes softened, filled with both sorrow and resolve. Not always, but every time we refuse to move, every time we stand firm, we make it harder for hate to win. We chip away at the wall. Malik sat back, his heart pounding. He wanted to believe his father. He wanted to believe that holding on to dignity could change the world. But in this moment, surrounded by silence, he felt small. Captain Everett walked past again, his expression unreadable. He glanced briefly at Christopher, then at Catherine. The tension in his jaw revealed the conflict within him. He wanted order, but order was not the same as justice. He paused, as though considering whether to say more, but continued on without a word. Malik watched him go, his chest tight with disappointment. Authority, it seemed, was more concerned with convenience than with truth. Christopher saw the look on his son's face. He leaned closer, his voice low, meant only for Malik. Son, strength isn't always loud. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay seated when the world tells you to move. Malik absorbed the words, repeating them silently in his mind. Stay seated, stay firm. But inside, another voice whispered doubts. What if staying seated wasn't enough? What if no one cared? What if dignity didn't matter when the world refused to see it? The internal battle wore on him, pulling at the edges of his courage. Samantha Cruz returned, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She hesitated by their row. Sir, she said softly, the captain wants me to remind you that disruptive behavior could result in authorities meeting the plane when we land. Malik's stomach dropped. He looked at his father in alarm, but Christopher remained composed. We're not disruptive, he replied evenly. We're sitting in our assigned seats. If the authorities wish to meet us, we'll welcome them. Samantha blinked, unprepared for such calm defiance. She nodded stiffly and left. Malik whispered urgently, Dad, what if they really bring the police? What if they drag us off? Everyone has their cameras out. What if the whole world sees it? Christopher looked at him with quiet intensity. Then the whole world will see the truth. And sometimes, Malik, truth needs to be seen, no matter how painful. The boy sat back, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His father's words steadied him, but fear lingered. He thought of viral videos he had seen online, of people humiliated in public. Would he and his father become another clip, another headline? The thought both terrified him and sparked something else, a flicker of defiance. If the world was watching, maybe they could see, maybe they could understand. Time passed slowly, every minute stretching into an eternity. Catherine muttered again, this time more pointed. Unbelievable. Standards have fallen so low. I will not share space with people who don't belong here. The words hit Malik like a blow. He wanted to shout, to rise, to demand she stop. But once again, His father's steady hand on his arm restrained him. "Not yet," Christopher whispered. "Patience is strength too." Malik clenched his jaw, tears burning at the corners of his eyes. He hated the helplessness. He hated the silence. Yet in his father's calm, he sensed something larger, something deliberate, as though Christopher was waiting for the right moment to reveal a truth no one expected. The engines droned on, carrying them eastward through the night sky. Inside, the cabin was a crucible of tension, every glance, every whisper feeding the fire. Malik stared at his reflection in the window once more. This time, he didn't just see fear. He saw something else forming behind his eyes. Resolve. The storm was not over. He could feel it building, but perhaps, just perhaps, when it broke, he would no longer feel small. The night outside the window stretched vast and silent, but inside the cabin of Flight 227, the silence was brittle, every second carrying the weight of things unsaid. Malik sat rigid in his seat, his small fist pressed against his thighs. He told himself to breathe evenly, to mirror his father's calm, but his body betrayed him with every shaky inhale. Christopher kept his gaze steady, watching the aisle, sensing the shift in the air. He knew when a confrontation was coming. Life had taught him to feel it, like the pressure drop before a storm. Catherine Whitmore was not finished. People like her rarely walked away quietly. He was right. From row 4 came the scrape of her seatbelt unfastening, the sharp click of heels against the carpet. Catherine appeared once more, her cream suit bright against the dimmed cabin lights. Her face carried a mixture of indignation and certainty. She did not glance at Christopher first. Her eyes locked onto Malik, sharp and unyielding. "Young man," she said, her voice low but loud enough for nearby rows to hear, "you should be ashamed of yourself, sitting in a seat that doesn't belong to you." Malik froze. Her words pierced deeper than the cold air conditioning or the hum of the engines. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Shame wrapped around him like chains. Christopher stood slowly, unfolding to his full height. His presence filled the aisle without aggression, just a calm authority that made people sit straighter. "That's enough," he said evenly. His tone was quiet, but it silenced the murmurs instantly. "You will not speak to my son that way." Catherine blinked, startled for a moment, then hardened. "I'm only speaking the truth. First class is not." She stopped herself, catching the weight of listening ears, but the unfinished sentence lingered in the air, its meaning unmistakable. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. A man across the aisle shook his head, muttering under his breath. A young woman discreetly lifted her phone higher, recording every second. The performance of civility was over. This was open now, and everyone knew it. Captain Everett re-entered the cabin, drawn by the rising tension. His brow furrowed when he saw Catherine standing over row 2. Her finger pointed in Malik's direction. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said firmly, "please return to your seat." She turned to him, her voice rising. "Captain, I will not sit quietly while standards fall apart around me. I have earned the right to fly here. And if you won't enforce order, I will contact the airline directly. You are failing your most loyal customers." Everett's jaw tightened. He glanced at Christopher, then back at Catherine. He wanted to end it quickly, to avoid headlines, but he could no longer deny what was unfolding. "Mrs. Whitmore," he repeated, more forcefully, "return to your seat, now." Catherine's eyes blazed, But she obeyed reluctantly, snapping her bag closed and storming back to row 4. The tension she left behind, however, clung to the cabin like smoke. Malik stared at his father, wide-eyed. His chest heaved with the weight of everything unsaid. Christopher placed a hand on his son's shoulder, steadying him once more. "You did nothing wrong," Christopher whispered. But Malik's eyes glistened. "Why does she hate us?" he asked, voice trembling. "She doesn't even know us." Christopher swallowed, his throat tightening. He wanted to shield his son from the answer, but the truth demanded honesty. "Because some people carry walls inside them," he said softly. "Walls built from fear, ignorance, and entitlement. When they see us, they don't see people. They see a challenge to their walls, and they lash out." Malik lowered his gaze. "It feels like we'll never belong." Christopher's heart ached, but he drew his son's face up gently, with a finger under his chin. "We belong, Malik. Our presence is proof of that. And sometimes the most powerful act of belonging is refusing to move when the world tells you to." The boy nodded faintly, but tears pooled at the corners of his eyes. "Across the cabin," Catherine muttered to a fellow passenger, her voice sharp enough to be overheard. "This airline will regret humiliating me. They don't know who they're dealing with." Christopher heard the words, but did not react. He remained seated, calm, though his mind churned with calculation. How far should he let this play out? How much should his son witness before he stepped in with the full weight of his authority? He balanced the scales in silence, weighing dignity against exposure, patience against justice. Samantha Cruz approached cautiously, her professional mask cracking under the strain. "Sir," she said softly, addressing Christopher, "the captain and I are doing our best to maintain order. Please, I ask you help us keep the peace." Christopher looked at her steadily. "Peace without justice is only quiet oppression. My son will not learn that lesson tonight." The word struck Samantha harder than he realized. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, retreating down the aisle without argument. Malik exhaled shakily. "Dad, do you think she'll stop?" Christopher shook his head slightly. "No, not yet. But storms always end, son, and sometimes the storm clears the sky." The engines roared steadily, the plane cutting through the night. But inside, the tension had reached its breaking point. Passengers whispered openly now, some condemning Catherine's behavior, others nervously wondering how far this would go. Phones continued recording, their small lights glowing faintly like fireflies in the dark. Malik leaned his head against the window, his breath fogging the glass. He wanted the flight to end, wanted to step off the plane and leave the suffocating weight behind. But another part of him, the part shaped by his father's calm resolve, wanted to see it through. He wanted to know that dignity could win. Christopher sat upright, eyes closed briefly, gathering strength. He knew the moment was coming when silence would no longer suffice, when calm presence would have to give way to revelation. He prayed for wisdom, prayed that when that moment arrived, his son would see not just his father's strength, but his own. The captain passed once more, glancing at Christopher. For a fleeting second, respect flickered in his eyes, hesitant, but real. He said nothing, but the acknowledgement was there. Malik noticed. "He looked different this time," the boy whispered. Christopher nodded faintly, because even those who stay silent can feel the weight of truth. Malik stared at his father, a strange mixture of awe and confusion swirling in his chest. He wanted to understand, wanted to believe that patience and dignity could bend even the strongest walls. But as Catherine shifted noisily again in row 4, her mutters sharp and bitter. Malik wondered if patience would ever be enough. The engines hummed. The stars glittered faintly above the clouds. And in row 2, a boy and his father sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the moment when everything would finally break. The cabin lights glowed faintly, casting long shadows across the faces of the passengers who were pretending to sleep but couldn't. It wasn't just the hum of the engines that kept them awake. It was the tension that refused to die, the sense that something was building in row 2, and they were all trapped inside the same pressurized story. Malik pressed his forehead against the cold window. He traced shapes in the condensation, small circles that blurred as quickly as he made them. The night sky outside looked endless, but inside he felt cornered. Every sound, every whisper seemed to carry judgment. He replayed Catherine's words again and again, the way she had said he didn't belong. He hated how much it stung, hated that it still echoed inside him like a cruel refrain. Christopher sat beside him, silent, eyes closed. But he wasn't asleep. He was thinking, calculating. For years, he had chosen discretion, letting his influence move quietly, letting his power remain invisible. But tonight, watching his son shrink under the weight of another person's disdain, he realized silence was no longer a shield. Silence was teaching Malik the wrong lesson. The scrape of a seatbelt cut through the low murmur. Catherine Whitmore rose again. Her heels clicked against the aisle carpet with deliberate rhythm, as though each step declared ownership of the space. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some groaned under their breath. But no one stopped her. She stopped at row 2, arms crossed, her chin tilted in quiet defiance. "Captain Everett may be too polite to say it," she began, her voice just loud enough for the nearest rows. "But the rest of us shouldn't have to tolerate this circus. You're ruining the atmosphere for everyone else." Malik's chest constricted. He wanted to disappear into the leather seat, wanted to vanish from her line of sight. His body stiffened, but his father's hand settled on his shoulder like an anchor. Christopher opened his eyes and looked up at Catherine. His expression was calm, but there was steel behind it now. "Mrs. Whitmore, return to your seat." Catherine's eyes flashed. I will not sit quietly while the standards of this airline collapse around me. This is first class, not a social experiment. I've invested too much into this company to watch it cheapened." Malik's brow furrowed. Invested. He clung to the word, puzzled by it. He glanced at his father, who remained steady, silent for a moment longer. The passengers leaned in. Phones rose higher. This wasn't just an argument anymore. This was theater, and the audience craved resolution. Christopher exhaled slowly, then stood. The movement was deliberate, controlled. His height and presence seemed to shift the air. He looked Catherine directly in the eye, his calm voice carrying just enough for the cabin to hear. "You speak of investment," he said. "Tell me, Mrs. Whitmore, how much have you really invested in this airline?" Catherine blinked, startled. "Enough to know I've earned respect here. More than enough to expect better than this." Christopher nodded slowly. "Interesting, because I've invested too. Quite a bit, actually. Enough that when I speak, the board listens. Enough that when contracts are signed, my name is the one that makes them possible." Whispers rippled through the cabin. Catherine's face faltered for the first time. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Christopher's gaze remained steady. "I am Christopher Langston, majority shareholder of this airline. I don't fly under that name often. I prefer to travel quietly, to be seen as just another passenger. But tonight, I see that silence has a cost. Gas broke out across the cabin. A man in the back muttered, "No way." The young woman with her phone whispered excitedly, "Oh my God, it's him." The murmurs grew into a chorus, disbelief turning into recognition. Malik's eyes widened, his mouth parting in awe. He had known his father was powerful, had known he built companies, negotiated deals, influenced entire industries. But hearing him say it out loud, here, in the middle of a plane, where people doubted their very right to sit, hearing him claim it was different, it was transformative. Catherine's face flushed crimson. "You're lying," she said sharply, though her voice trembled. "If you were who you claimed to be, you wouldn't be sitting here with us." Christopher tilted his head slightly. "Perhaps that's the problem, Mrs. Whitmore. You assume ownership looks like separation. I believe ownership should look like presence. And tonight, it looks like me, sitting beside my son, refusing to move." The cabin erupted in murmurs again. Several passengers clapped softly before stopping, unsure if it was appropriate. Phones continued recording. The truth was no longer contained. It was spilling into the digital world with every passing second. Catherine took a step back, her composure cracking. "This is outrageous. If you are who you say you are, then you should understand loyalty. I've been a customer for decades." Christopher's expression softened, though his tone remained firm. "Loyalty is not measured by years, Mrs. Whitmore. It's measured by respect, and right now, you've shown none." Malik's chest swelled, pride surging where shame had been. His father's words washed over him like light breaking through storm clouds. For the first time that night, he lifted his chin, no longer shrinking from Catherine's gaze. Captain Everett appeared again, his face pale, his voice carefully neutral. "Mr. Langston," he said, "if what you claim is true, Christopher cut him off gently but firmly. It is true. You know it. The board knows it. Corporate knows it. And soon, the world watching these recordings will know it too." The captain hesitated, then nodded faintly. He understood now. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Catherine stumbled back toward her seat, her confidence unraveling. Passengers whispered openly now, some shaking their heads, others nodding in approval of Christopher's calm stand. Malik turned to his father, his voice hushed but urgent. "Dad, you said it. You told them who you are." Christopher looked at him, his expression gentle. "Sometimes, son, patience must give way to truth. Sometimes silence is mistaken for weakness. Tonight, they needed to see that strength wears many faces." Malik swallowed hard, his chest tight with a mixture of relief and awe. For the first time since boarding, he felt the weight of shame lift. He belonged not because of his father's title, but because dignity had been claimed and defended before everyone. The plane droned onward through the night, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. No one whispered now. No one doubted. They all knew the truth. And though Malik was only 13, he would remember this moment for the rest of his life, the night his father chose revelation over silence. The night dignity stood taller than prejudice, 30,000 feet above the ground. The hum of the engines carried on as if nothing had changed. But inside the cabin of Flight 227, everything felt different. Catherine Whitmore had retreated to row 4, her face tight with humiliation, her words caught in her throat. Christopher Langston's revelation hung in the air like a struck bell, reverberating through every corner of first class. Passengers stared openly now, no longer pretending to read or sleep. Phones were raised without shame, their cameras glowing like tiny spotlights. The silence was no longer brittle. It was electric, charged with the sense that something important was happening, something larger than a dispute over a seat. Malik sat straighter in his chair, his small shoulders no longer hunched. For the first time since the confrontation began, he felt air fill his lungs without resistance. His father's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes silence is mistaken for weakness. Tonight, truth had shattered that illusion. A passenger across the aisle, a woman in her late 20s, lowered her phone slightly and spoke softly, but loud enough for those around her to hear. "He's telling the truth. That's Christopher Langston." "I recognize him from Forbes," another man muttered. "I saw him in a Bloomberg interview last year. He owns half this airline." Whispers turned into ripples of recognition, and the ripples built into a wave. Within minutes, hashtags began appearing online, captions scribbled into live streams. "Lo, Langston on board. Lo, flight 27, lo, seat 20. The internet was already awake. Catherine fumbled with her phone, her hands shaking as she tapped furiously. Malik saw her reflection in the dark screen of the window. She looked less like the picture of confidence she had projected earlier and more like someone cornered, her certainty unraveling thread by thread. Christopher remained seated, calm as ever, though his mind was alert. He knew the cameras were not his enemy tonight. They were witnesses. They would carry this story far beyond the cabin, into homes, offices, and boardrooms, and he knew the stakes every word he spoke would soon echo across the world. Samantha Cruz returned, her face pale but composed. She stopped by row 2 and lowered her voice. "Mr. Langston, I apologize for everything." I didn't realize Christopher lifted a hand gently, cutting her off. "You shouldn't apologize because of who I am. You should apologize because of what happened, because a paying passenger, my son, was humiliated in front of this entire cabin, because silence was chosen over fairness until the cameras made silence impossible." Samantha's throat tightened. The words struck her harder than she expected. She nodded faintly, unable to respond. Malik watched her retreat, his chest tightening with a strange mix of pity and anger. He whispered to his father, "Do you think she really cares? Or is she just scared?" Now Christopher's eyes softened. "Fear often masquerades as care. Time will show us the difference." Passengers began murmuring again, some directing their words toward Christopher. "We're with you, sir. Unbelievable what you went through. She should be banned for life." Their support grew louder, bolder. The balance of power had shifted completely. Catherine snapped her head toward them, her voice sharp. "You don't understand. He's manipulating this situation. This is about me being mistreated as a loyal customer." Her words rang hollow. Phones caught every syllable, every frantic wave of her hand. The young woman across the aisle shook her head. "Ma'am, everyone here saw how you treated that boy. It's on video. Millions of people will see it." Catherine's face drained of color. For the first time, she seemed to realize the magnitude of what she had unleashed. Malik leaned close to his father, whispering, "It feels like everyone finally sees. But why did it take you saying who you are for them to believe?" Christopher inhaled deeply, holding his son's gaze. "Because the world still struggles to listen to truth without power behind it. That's what we're here to change. Malik, that's why we cannot move." The boy nodded, the words carving themselves into his memory. Captain Everett reappeared, his face tight with tension. He crouched slightly, speaking quietly but urgently. "Mr. Langston, the situation is escalating quickly. Our comms team on the ground says social media is already flooded with posts from this flight. The airline is monitoring. They're asking me to maintain control." Christopher tilted his head. Control doesn't come from suppressing truth. It comes from embracing it. Tell your team the world isn't watching because of me. It's watching because of how you all handled my son. The captain's jaw clenched. He wanted to argue, but the weight of Christopher's gaze stopped him. He nodded curtly and walked away, his radio buzzing faintly at his side. Malik stared at his father, wide-eyed. "They're scared, aren't they?" "Yes," Christopher replied softly. "But fear can be a teacher if they're willing to learn." A murmur rose from the back of the cabin. A middle-aged man stood, raising his voice so it carried. "I've flown with this airline for 15 years. I've never seen anything like this. That woman insulted a child, and the crew nearly sided with her. This isn't just about tonight. It's about who gets treated with dignity and who doesn't." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then stronger. Catherine shrank into her seat, her lips pressed tight, her hands trembling. Malik's chest swelled. For the first time all night, he felt the tide turning not just because of his father, but because other voices had finally joined the chorus. He whispered, "They're speaking now." Christopher nodded. Truth has a way of spreading once someone dares to start it. The young woman across the aisle lifted her phone again, speaking into her live stream. "You're watching this in real time. A boy and his father stood their ground, and now the airline's own captain and crew are scrambling. This is history in the making." Malik heard her words and felt something shift inside him. He wasn't just a boy in a seat anymore. He was part of something bigger, something that would ripple far beyond this flight. Catherine muttered bitterly, "This is ridiculous. All of you are blowing this out of proportion." Christopher turned his head slowly toward her. His voice was calm, but it carried through the cabin with unmistakable clarity. "No, Mrs. Whitmore, for too long, the world has minimized moments like this. Tonight, the proportion is finally honest." A hush fell. The engines roared on, but inside the cabin every ear was tuned to row 2. Malik sat taller, his father's words echoing like a shield around him. Phones buzzed as notifications flooded screens. Already, the story was trending. Already, the world outside was leaning in, and 30,000 feet above the ground, a father and son held their place, refusing to yield, refusing to let dignity be moved. The glow of screens flickered across the cabin like firelight. Every other seat seemed to have a phone raised, cameras trained on row 2. The story had already escaped the confines of the aircraft. It was spreading at the speed of light, pouring into timelines and feeds, pulling strangers across the world into the drama unfolding 30,000 feet above the ground. Christopher Langston sat upright, composed, his presence radiating calm authority. Malik sat beside him, wide-eyed, his body taut with the electricity of the moment. For the first time all night, he wasn't just afraid, he was curious. What would happen now that the world knew who his father was? Catherine Whitmore hunched in row 4, whispering furiously into her phone. Her fingers tapped at the screen, her face flushed. Each time she raised her head, she met the eyes of fellow passengers who no longer offered her silent support but open disapproval. The balance of the cabin had shifted. She was isolated now, and she knew it. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. steady but tight. Ladies and gentlemen, we ask for your continued cooperation. Please remain seated as we continue toward New York. We are aware of the situation in the cabin, and we're working with corporate to address it appropriately. Thank you for your patience. Malik leaned toward his father. They sound nervous. Christopher nodded slightly. They are, because this is no longer about a seat. It's about how they choose to define fairness while the world watches. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle and stopped at row 2, lowering her voice so only Christopher and Malik could hear. "Mr. Langston," she said, "corporate headquarters is requesting a direct line to you. They're asking if you'll take a call." Whispers rippled through the passengers who overheard. Malik's heart pounded. He'd seen his father take calls from CEOs, politicians, even world leaders, but never in a setting like this, never with strangers recording every move. Christopher glanced at Malik, then back at the attendant. "Yes, bring me the handset." Moments later, she returned with the SATCOM phone. Christopher accepted it calmly, placing it against his ear. His voice was low, but Malik could hear the steel beneath it. "This is Christopher Langston." The cabin quieted again, passengers craning to listen, though they couldn't hear the voice on the other end. Christopher's side of the conversation carried enough weight to draw every gaze. "Yes," he said. "I'm on Flight 227. "Yes, that's correct. My son and I were targeted." The crew hesitated until the cameras made silence impossible. He paused, listening. His jaw tightened slightly. "No, this is not just an isolated incident. It is systemic, and if you attempt to minimize it, you will be complicit." Malik watched, his chest tight with pride and fear. His father wasn't just speaking for them anymore. He was speaking for something larger, something that stretched beyond the cabin. Christopher's tone deepened. "Here is what will happen. 1, the passenger who instigated this will be permanently banned. 2, every crew member who participated or enabled this behavior will face review, starting tonight. 3, the airline will immediately establish an independent oversight protocol for bias complaints. Not in a month, not in a quarter. Tonight, I will not settle for less." Gas rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, astonished at the clarity of his demands. Christopher leaned forward, his voice steady. "And 4, when we land, you will have a public statement ready acknowledging fault. Not a vague apology, not a corporate brush-off. A statement that names what happened and pledges reform. Because if you do not, I will ensure the story that has already gone viral becomes the story that defines your airline for years to come." Malik's pulse raced. His father's calm sounded like thunder. He realized this wasn't anger, it was control. The kind of control that could bend entire systems. The voice on the other end crackled faintly, offering hurried words. Christopher's reply was firm. "Then you understand? Good. Put it in motion now." He lowered the handset and handed it back to the attendant, whose hand shook slightly as she took it. The passengers erupted in hushed applause, some clapping openly. Phones recorded every second, broadcasting it beyond the cabin. Malik's cheeks flushed with pride. He leaned closer to his father. "Dad, did you just give them orders?" Christopher's lips curved faintly. "No, I gave them choices, but the consequences made the right choice very clear." Malik exhaled, shaking his head in wonder. "It's like you're the captain now." Christopher looked at him softly. "No, son. The captain flies the plane. I'm reminding them what direction justice requires." Catherine snapped suddenly from row 4, her voice shrill. "This is outrageous. He's blackmailing the airline in front of us." All eyes turned to her. A man in row 3 shot back. his voice sharp. "No, ma'am. He's holding them accountable. There's a difference." Another passenger chimed in. "You brought this on yourself. We all heard what you said to that boy." Catherine's mouth opened and closed, but the tide had turned completely. Phones pointed at her now, documenting every flinch, every stammer. She sank back into her seat, clutching her bag like a shield. Malik whispered to his father, "Do you think she'll ever admit she was wrong?" Christopher sighed softly. "Perhaps not tonight. But the world has already judged her, and sometimes public truth forces private reckoning." The young woman across the aisle lifted her phone again, speaking to her live stream. "You're seeing history, folks." A father stood his ground. The airline's owner revealed himself mid-flight, and reforms are being dictated right here, right now. This isn't just about a seat, it's about dignity. Malik listened, his chest swelling. For the first time, he felt like his pain had meaning beyond himself. His shame had transformed into testimony, his father's calm turning it into something powerful. The captain returned once more, his face tight but respectful. He leaned toward Christopher. "Headquarters confirmed your requests are in motion. I've also been instructed to thank you directly." Christopher inclined his head. "Don't thank me. Change the culture so no child has to endure this again." The captain swallowed, nodding faintly before walking away. Malik leaned back in his seat, his head buzzing with everything that had happened. He whispered, almost to himself, "I'll never forget this." Christopher turned to him, his eyes warm. "Good, because one day, Malik, you'll face your own moment, and you'll remember that dignity is not for sale, not for negotiation, not for compromise. You'll remember to stay seated when the world tells you to move." The engines droned on, carrying them closer to New York. The cabin had quieted again, but the silence was no longer brittle. It was heavy with realization, with respect, with the knowledge that something bigger than all of them had just unfolded in the narrow space between rows 2 and 4. Phones buzzed with notifications, hashtags climbing faster by the minute. Site 2A. Langston Flight. Dignity in the sky. The world was no longer watching passively. It was reacting, demanding answers, demanding change. And in seat 2B, Malik sat taller, his reflection in the window no longer small and uncertain. He saw himself differently now. He saw someone who belonged, not because of his father's title, but because dignity had been defended in the face of prejudice. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, calm but lined with tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into New York. Please fasten your seat belts and prepare for landing." The words were routine, yet the cabin knew nothing about this flight was routine anymore. The passengers exchanged glances, their phones buzzing with endless notifications. They weren't just passengers anymore. They were witnesses to a story spiraling across the internet in real time. Malik's stomach fluttered as the nose of the plane dipped slightly. He clutched the armrest, not from fear of turbulence, but from the unknown waiting on the ground. He whispered to his father, "What do you think will happen when we land?" Christopher looked at him, his eyes steady, his tone measured. "The truth will be waiting for us. Cameras, reporters, maybe even the authorities. But whatever comes, we will face it with dignity." Malik nodded, though his chest tightened. He imagined stepping off the plane into a swarm of flashing lights, people shouting questions, strangers watching his every move. He was only 13. Was he ready for that? His hands trembled, but then his father's calm presence steadied him once more. The wheels lowered with a deep, mechanical thud. The vibration rattled the cabin. Catherine Whitmore stiffened in her seat, clutching her handbag as though it could shield her. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. She hadn't spoken again since the confrontation, but her silence carried no peace, only fear. The plane touched down with a sharp jolt, the roar of the reverse thrusters filling the cabin. Passengers applauded weakly, a nervous, automatic gesture, but the air still buzzed with tension, heavy and unrelenting. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, the young woman across the aisle whispered into her phone camera, "We've landed. I don't know what's about to happen, but I can tell you one thing, this isn't over. Not by a long shot." Christopher reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped quickly, sending a message with deliberate precision. Malik leaned slightly to peek, but all he saw was a short phrase sent to a contact labeled simply "board." The engines wound down as the plane rolled to a stop. The seatbelt sign chimed off, but no one moved. Instead, every passenger seemed to hold their breath. Outside the windows, flashing lights reflected off the fuselage police cars, camera crews, ground staff gathering in unusual numbers. A voice from the front of the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Authorities will be boarding shortly." Whispers rippled through the passengers. Phones lifted higher. The world was about to see. The door opened with a metallic hiss. Two uniformed officers stepped in, followed by a pair of men in dark suits carrying tablets. Their expressions were serious but professional. One of the suited men scanned the cabin, his eyes landing on Christopher. He nodded slightly, as if recognizing someone far above his pay grade. The officers walked past row 2, straight toward row 4. Catherine gasped. "Wait, what are you doing? I didn't do anything wrong, Mrs. Whitmore," one officer said evenly. "You've been reported for harassment and creating a disturbance on this flight. We'll need you to come with us." Catherine's voice rose in panic. "This is insane. He set me up. He's twisting everything." The passengers erupted in murmurs, some recording openly, others muttering under their breath. One man spoke loudly. "We all saw what you did." Another added, "It's on video. Millions have seen it already." The officers guided Catherine out of her seat. She protested the entire way, her voice growing shriller with each step. But no one defended her now. Not one voice rose in her support. By the time she was escorted off the plane, her power had evaporated entirely. Malik sat frozen, his heart racing. He had expected police. He hadn't expected them to go for her. His eyes darted to his father. "Dad, did you know they'd take her?" Christopher's expression was calm, though his eyes betrayed the weight of the moment. "I suspected. Actions have consequences. Son, tonight," she learned that. The suited men stepped forward then, addressing Christopher directly. "Mr. Langston, the airline's board has been monitoring the situation. They've asked us to escort you and your son off the plane privately, away from the crowd." Christopher shook his head. "No, we will disembark like every other passenger. Dignity doesn't hide." The men exchanged uneasy glances, but they didn't argue. The passengers stirred, realizing they were about to walk off this plane into history. Some whispered nervously, others with awe. Malik could barely breathe. His chest felt heavy with anticipation. Finally, the aisle cleared. The door loomed ahead, open to the flood of flashing cameras beyond. As Christopher and Malik stepped into the aisle, phones turned toward them, recording every second. The boy's legs trembled, but his father's steady stride carried him forward, They walked together down the narrow passageway, into the tunnel of sound and light. Voices shouted questions. Cameras flashed like lightning. Malik squinted, overwhelmed, but Christopher raised his chin and kept walking, his calm unbroken. Reporters shouted from beyond the barrier, "Mr. Langston, will there be firings? What changes will you demand? How does it feel to be profiled on your own airline?" Christopher didn't stop, but his voice, calm and resonant, carried over the noise. "Tonight is not about me. It's about a boy who was told he didn't belong, and a culture that allowed it to happen. That ends now." Malik felt the words sink deep inside him. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was part of something larger, a story that would live beyond this night. As they stepped into the terminal, surrounded by flashing lights and echoing questions, Malik realized that the seat he had fought for was more than leather and legroom. It was a symbol, and his father had shown him that sometimes the most powerful way to claim your place in the world is simply to refuse to move. The terminal was chaos. Bright camera flashes lit up the polished floor. Reporters shouted over one another, and passengers from other flights craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the man and boy at the center of the storm. Security officers formed a shaky barrier, their arms outstretched to hold back the crowd. Christopher Langston walked forward with steady steps, Malik beside him. The boy's heart pounded so hard he thought the cameras might pick up the sound. He had never been in the spotlight before, not like this. But his father's calm radiated into him, giving him the courage to keep moving. "Mr. Langston, will you address the incident?" someone shouted. "Is it true you demanded reforms mid-flight?" Another voice cut through. "What consequences will the airline face?" Christopher stopped near the bank of microphones hastily set up by the airline's public relations team. He stood tall, resting a hand lightly on Malik's shoulder. The clamor dulled, as though the room itself recognized the gravity of the moment. Cameras focused, phones streamed live. The silence before his words was electric. He began softly, his tone calm yet resolute. "Tonight, on Flight 227, my son and I experienced what too many people experience every day, being told we do not belong, not because of our tickets, not because of our conduct, but because of the color of our skin." Gas rippled through the crowd. Malik looked up at his father, awe burning behind his eyes. Christopher's voice grew stronger. "This is not about one woman's words, or one crew's hesitation. This is about a system that too often chooses silence over justice. That silence ends tonight, because when a 13-year-old boy is humiliated in front of a cabin full of people, and no one intervenes until a camera forces them to something as deeply broken." Reporters scribbled furiously. Camera shutters snapped like gunfire. Malik's throat tightened, not from fear now, but from pride. Christopher's gaze swept the room. "I revealed my identity tonight, not because I wanted recognition, but because I wanted accountability. As majority shareholder of this airline, I have directed immediate changes. Starting tomorrow, every frontline employee will undergo mandatory training in dignity, empathy, and de-escalation. Every passenger complaint of bias will go directly to an independent oversight board, and every case will be publicly reported, so no voice is silenced again." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then louder, until it echoed off the terminal walls. Malik blinked rapidly, trying to take in the sound. Christopher continued, his tone sharper now. "To those who think this is about special treatment, it is not. It is about equal treatment. My son paid for his seat like anyone else. He belongs there, like anyone else, and I will not rest until every passenger, no matter who they are, feels the same security when they fly. The young woman from across the aisle stepped forward, holding her phone still streaming. "Mr. Langston," she asked, "what do you say to people watching this who've been through the same thing, but don't have your power to fight back?" Christopher paused, his eyes softening. He glanced at Malik, then back at the cameras. "I say this, you are not alone. Every time you stand firm, every time you refuse to yield your dignity, you are chipping away at walls built by prejudice. And I promise you, tonight is the beginning of tearing those walls down faster than ever before." The crowd roared in approval. Phones vibrated with notifications, streams exploding with comments. Malik caught snippets historic, powerful. Dignity in the sky, scrolling faster than he could read. Catherine Whitmore was nowhere to be seen. Word spread quickly that she had been escorted out of the terminal through a side exit, her protest drowned out by the roar of the crowd outside. Malik thought briefly of her pale face as she was led away, and though part of him wanted to revel in her humiliation, another part of him felt something else, a strange pity. His father's words echoed in his mind. Public Truth Force's private reckoning. The airline CEO finally appeared, flanked by board members, his expression tight. He stepped to the microphones, clearly shaken. "On behalf of this airline, I want to personally apologize to Mr. Langston, to his son, and to every passenger who witnessed what happened tonight. This was unacceptable. We will not make excuses. We will change." His words were rushed, his tone rehearsed. But Malik didn't care. The fact that he was standing there at all, humbled and exposed, felt like justice. Christopher gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement, then turned back to the crowd. "Apologies are words. Change is action. The world is watching, and I intend to make sure the promises made tonight are fulfilled." He stepped away from the microphones then, guiding Malik gently through the sea of lights and questions. Security cleared a path toward a waiting car. As they walked, Malik leaned close, his voice barely audible. "Dad, I don't think I'll ever be afraid to speak again." Christopher smiled faintly, his eyes soft. "Good, because the next time, Malik, it may be your voice the world needs to hear." They stepped out into the cool night air. The city lights of New York glowed in the distance, restless and alive. Behind them, the terminal buzzed with the aftershocks of what had just unfolded. Ahead of them lay a future reshaped by the stand they had taken. For Malik, the night had begun with shame, fear, and silence. It ended with resolve, pride, and the unshakable lesson that dignity is not granted by others. It is claimed and defended, no matter the cost. As the car pulled away from the curb, the boy stared out the window at the flashing lights fading behind them. His reflection looked different now, older, stronger, no longer small. He whispered the words his father had told him, tasting their weight. "Stay seated when the world tells you to move." Christopher heard him and placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder. Neither spoke again as the car merged into the city's current. Words were no longer needed. The lesson had been written into the night sky, carved into history, and broadcast to millions. And somewhere above, in the quiet dark where Flight 227 had carved its path, the stars shone brighter, as though the sky itself had witnessed the storm and cleared for something new. As Flight 227 touched down, the world had already changed. What began as a cruel attempt to strip a boy of his dignity ended as a defining stand for justice. Christopher Langston's calm strength and Malik's quiet courage revealed what prejudice tries to hide, that every person has the right to belong, to be respected, and to be seen. Catherine Whitmore was escorted away, but the true reckoning was larger than her removal. The airline pledged sweeping reforms, passengers left forever changed, and millions watching online were reminded that silence is complicity. In the end, it wasn't power or wealth that left its mark. It was the simple refusal to move from a rightful place. And as Malik looked out at the flashing lights of New York that night, he carried a lesson he would never forget. Dignity is not granted by others. It is claimed and defended. This story is more than just an airline scandal. It is a mirror held up to society. Will we choose silence, or will we choose justice? If this story moved you, help us spread the message. Like, share, and subscribe, so you won't miss the next chapter in our journey to honor truth, courage, and humanity.